In August 1982, in a quiet Maryland forest, a couple out hunting for mushrooms stumbled upon a rusting trunk that held not treasure, but tragedy. When they pried open this chest, they discovered a Jane Doe who has gone down in history as the cheerleader in the trunk. For over 40 years, this mystery surrounding these skeletal remains has haunted and perplexed investigators. Forensic examiners determined that the woman had likely perished as recently as the spring of 1982, or as early as 10 years prior. The exact cause couldn't be ascertained due to decomposition, but it was classified as a slaying given the circumstances. Authorities described the victim as a white female of petite build and suggested that she was about 5'3" and likely weighed about 100 pounds in life. Her age was initially estimated to be between 18 and 45 years old, but this was later narrowed to about 18 to 27. She had medium-length dark brown hair that appeared dyed, with investigators finding auburn hair strands in the trunk, suggesting her natural hair color. A notable finding was her extensive dental work. She had numerous silver dental fillings, 2 front teeth with crowns, and 1 gold tooth. Her skeletal features further suggested she was well-nourished, consistent with a middle-class upbringing. Examination of her bones showed signs of physical stress and healed injuries. She had a spinal defect and damage to her feet, consistent with repetitive, high-impact activity. Such conditions are often seen in gymnastics, dance, or cheerleading, which led investigators to suspect she had been involved in those activities. This athletic background inspired the Jane Doe's cheerleader in the trunk moniker. Despite extensive efforts, investigators were unable to identify the victim. Dozens of missing person files were cross-checked. At least 21 potential matches from around the country were examined and ruled out. In the absence of concrete answers, several theories have emerged about who this Jane Doe was and how she met her fate. One theory highlights her apparent athletic background. Perhaps she was indeed a cheerleader or gymnast. However, if she had been a student athlete, it's puzzling that no friends, teammates, or family members reported her missing at the time. This has led some to suggest that her lifestyle might have been outside of a traditional school or family environment. For instance, one popular speculation is that she could have been a dancer at a club. This can be a physically demanding job that might account for the same types of injuries. Further, it's been suggested that frequent high heel usage could explain the damage on her remains. If true, this scenario could also explain why her disappearance was not immediately reported. She may have been estranged from her family, or living a transient life where her absence went unnoticed for a longer time. Alternatively, it's been suggested that she may have been slain by a quote-unquote boyfriend who may have isolated her from friends and family and forced her into that line of work. Another theory focuses on the perpetrator and the location of the crime. The remote site and the use of a trunk to conceal the body suggest an effort to hide evidence. Some investigators have floated the idea of a transient serial perpetrator, possibly a long-haul truck driver, being responsible. Frederick County is crisscrossed by major highways like I-70, and law enforcement has noted patterns of certain truckers committing offenses along American highways. Under this theory, the victim may have been picked up in another city or state and slain, with her body dumped in rural Maryland to avoid detection by authorities. Notably, the Doe network profile on the woman indicates that there's insufficient DNA available for profiling. It's unclear to me if the authorities have retained the services of Othram or a similar company to attempt to sequence her genome from the limited evidence. Notably, Othram has had significant success in cases previously thought to be impossible due to DNA degradation. From there, it would be possible to conduct a forensic genetic genealogy analysis and likely give this Jane Doe her name back, if not solve the crime itself. In late September 1994, the peaceful town of Grantham in Lincolnshire, England, was shaken by a horrifying crime perpetrated by a disturbed individual known as the Overalls Man. Julie Pacey, a 38-year-old mother of two, was found slain in her own home on the afternoon of Monday, September 26, 1994. Her 14-year-old daughter, Helen, discovered Julie's lifeless body on the bathroom floor after returning home from school around 4:15 p.m. At first, the teenager thought her mother had simply collapsed, but paramedics soon noticed telltale marks on Julie's neck. The brutality of the crime, committed in broad daylight in a supposedly safe residential neighborhood, left the community in shock and desperate for answers. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Julie Pacey's death was ruled a slaying almost immediately. Investigators determined she had been strangled from behind with some kind of cord or wire, and that she was also subjected to SA by her attacker. Yet despite the violence of the act, there were virtually no signs of a struggle or forced entry in the house. Julie's fingernails were still neatly manicured and unbroken, and nothing in the bedroom or bathroom was disturbed. This suggested that the assailant may have surprised Julie so quickly that she had no chance to fight back. The only immediate clue that something was amiss in the otherwise tidy home was that one odd item appeared to be missing. Julie's distinctive Luc de Roche wristwatch, which she had recently purchased on a trip to France and always wore, was gone. Aside from that, Julie's purse, valuables, and other belongings were left untouched, indicating that robbery wasn't the primary motive. Investigators painstakingly reconstructed Julie's final day to understand how this heinous crime unfolded. Monday, September 26, 1994, had begun normally for the Pacey family. Julie lived with her husband of 18 years, Andrew, who worked as a plumber. They also had two children, Helen and Matthew. They lived in a comfortable home on Longcliffe Road in Grantham. That morning, Andrew left early for work on a job across town, and the children went off to school. Julie's routine on weekdays involved working a part-time shift at a local preschool and often caring for a neighbor's daughter after school. That was, except on Mondays, the only day when the neighbor's child would never come over. And keep this in mind, because it suggests that the sinister individual we are about to meet may have stalked his target for some time. Monday afternoons were one of the few times Julie would reliably be alone at home, a detail that in hindsight appeared significant. Julie left home around 10 a.m. to do her usual shift helping at the nursery. She finished work around 2 p.m. that day and made a brief impromptu visit to her parents, who lived only a couple of miles away. Not long after, by about 2:30 p.m., witnesses spotted Julie casually window shopping in Grantham's town center. This indicates she didn't stay long at her parents' house before heading into town. Within minutes, Julie was seen back in her car, a distinctive maroon Audi. Neighbors noticed her parking in her driveway around 2:45 p.m. What happened next in the short window before Julie's daughter found her is a crucial part of the timeline. Evidence inside the house showed that after getting home, Julie changed out of her work clothes and likely began a few ordinary day-to-day activities. She also had laid out some makeup items and nail polish remover on the bed, as if she was in the middle of touching up or removing her makeup. These little details suggest Julie felt comfortable and safe at home, unaware of any looming danger in those moments. Investigators believe Julie may have left the house one more time briefly that afternoon. One witness, a friend who knew her, was adamant they saw Julie driving away from the town center back toward home around 3 o'clock. It's possible Julie ran a quick errand or went on a short trip after 2:45, before finally returning for good. Adding to this, a neighbor saw her come back home and have a direct interaction with the key suspect in the case around 3:10. If all these accounts are true, that left a very narrow window for the perpetrator to strike. Sometime between roughly 3:15 p.m. and 4:15 p.m., Julie Pacey was attacked and slain in her house. By the time Helen came home from school at 4:15, the crime had already occurred, and the perp had departed from the scene. This implies the predator had at most an hour to enter the home and commit his heinous acts, all in daylight on a residential street. All in all, it was an incredibly risky and precisely timed attack, suggesting that this had been planned out well in advance. Almost immediately, detectives honed in on some strange occurrences reported in the neighborhood around the time of the attack. Several residents recalled seeing an unfamiliar middle-aged man in blue overalls lurking in the area before, during, and slightly after Julie's death. This individual, quickly nicknamed the Overalls Man by the police and press, would become the primary person of interest, though his identity remains unknown. One key sighting came from Julie's own household. On the Friday prior to the attack, September 23, 1994, Julie had been at home in the afternoon, expecting the neighbor's daughter, who she usually watched after school. Around 3:30, the doorbell rang while Julie was vacuuming upstairs. Assuming it was the young girl arriving, Julie shouted for her to come in. Instead, to her surprise, a scruffy man in blue overalls was standing in her hallway. The man claimed to be lost and asked for directions to a nearby street. Julie gave him directions and the man left, coincidentally passing right by the neighbor's daughter as she was just coming up to the house. The girl later helped police sketch an artist's impression of this stranger. She described him as about 35 years old, fairly chubby with a big red face, wearing blue overalls and brown work boots. Julie had also noticed his rough, calloused hands, and similarly thought he was around his late 30s. This encounter was odd at the time, but in hindsight extremely sinister. This mystery man had essentially talked his way into her home with an extremely flimsy excuse. The Overalls Man was spotted multiple times around the vicinity that week. Witnesses later reported seeing a similarly described ruddy-faced man in blue work overalls loitering around the neighborhood and even in Grantham town over several days. He had been approaching people to ask for various directions, often to places that were nowhere near each other. Notably, he never needed the directions repeated, as if the questions weren't his true motive. This pattern led police to suspect he was scoping out the area and perhaps probing for potential targets. On the morning after the slaying, an individual believed to be the same man was actually seen in the area again. Around 9 a.m. on September 27th, a witness saw the blue-overalled stranger walking nearby, appearing to search the grass, as if looking for something he might have dropped. That same day, a shopkeeper in town reported an odd customer wearing blue overalls who acted suspiciously and aggressive, standing too close and behaving strangely. All these sightings suggested that the Overalls Man stayed in Grantham through the crime, and perhaps even returned to the scene afterward. On the day of the attack itself, the Overalls Man's presence was also reported. In fact, a woman named Mar Thomas later told police she witnessed a near accident on Longcliff Road around 3:10 p.m. that day. Julie Pacey's car nearly hit a man in blue overalls who stepped into the street. Thomas saw Julie drive past and wave apologetically after braking to avoid him, then watched the man turn around and walk back in the direction of Julie's house. This happened just minutes before Julie likely arrived home for the final time. The implication is chilling. The Overalls Man may have deliberately caused a confrontation with Julie's car, perhaps to confirm she was the driver, or to prompt her reaction. Then he likely immediately followed her, perhaps confronting her over the event he may have orchestrated. If he indeed then entered her home moments later, everything unfolded quickly. By the time Julie's daughter came home about an hour later, the overalls man was gone without a trace. Over the course of the early investigation, the overalls man remained the chief suspect. In fact, no other meaningful suspects would ever emerge in this case, despite extensive police resources leaving no stone unturned. Police canvassed the area extensively, knocking on doors and interviewing construction crews, since there had been a lot of building work going on in the neighborhood at the time. The initial hope was that this mysterious figure was simply a tradesman working nearby. However, those leads went nowhere. No local workers matched his description. Investigators even considered that the blue overalls might have been a kind of disguise, clothing worn to blend in with real laborers so that neighbors wouldn't find his presence unusual. With their best lead frustratingly out of reach, detectives also pursued other angles. As in any case such as this, those closest to the victim were scrutinized. Julie Pacey's husband, Andrew, was questioned and quickly ruled out as a suspect. He had a rock-solid alibi, and by all accounts the couple's marriage was happy. Investigators found no evidence of any secret life, affair, or grudge in Julie's background that would point to an enemy or someone who wanted her harmed. Friends and family described Julie as a devoted mother and a popular, well-liked member of the community. It truly appeared that the perpetrator was likely a complete stranger. The utter lack of an obvious motive puzzled the police. This realization was unsettling. It meant the crime was one of pure violence and predation, not an act incidental to some other crime. The notion of a stranger randomly choosing a suburban house in daylight to commit such a crime was almost unheard of, suggesting an exceptionally brazen offender. In July 1994, a 21-year-old woman named Sharon Harper had been strangled in Grantham, her body found dumped at a construction site on the outskirts of town. The Harper slaying was also unsolved, and the coincidence of two strangulations of women in one town within a few months raised fears of a serial predator. The British media quickly jumped upon this idea and dubbed the potential perp the Grantham Strangler. While the authorities have investigated the possibility, the police publicly downplayed any connection between the two cases. By 1998, the authorities issued a statement that the two attacks were likely separate incidents, conducted by two different individuals. Notably, this was intended to calm fears about a serial predator in the area, though I have my doubts that people are more comforted by two perpetrators on the loose. But hey, maybe that's just me. In 2015, more than 20 years after the events that took Julie's life too soon, a significant development gave the investigation new life. Thanks to major advancements in forensic science, Lincolnshire police were able to retrieve a full DNA profile of the likely perp from samples preserved from the 1994 crime scene. Detectives had another powerful tool that wasn't available in the 90s, the National DNA Database. They ran the profile, hoping for a hit, an identification of someone who had their DNA on record. But no match was found. The DNA didn't correspond to any known offender in the database. Notably, it's unclear if forensic genetic genealogy has been applied to this case yet, and I strongly suspect that this cutting-edge science may lock up the overalls man once and for all. In July 2015, a curious incident occurred, perhaps showing that no good deed goes unpunished. In an unexpected twist, many viewers who saw an old BBC reenactment of the event mistakenly identified the actor who played Overalls Man as a suspect. Several callers phoned to let them know that they knew the guy, and that his name was Steve Watson. They noted that this man happened to match the description of the perp exactly, and even exhibited some similar mannerisms, and that he was basically exactly 20 years older. It turns out he was the extra who had volunteered to portray the perpetrator in the 90s, since he looked a lot like the sketch. Lincolnshire police ended up tracking him down later in 2015, questioned him, and took his DNA, and he was, of course, ultimately cleared of any wrongdoing. Over the years, several theories have emerged about who ended Julie Pacey and why. The most straightforward theory is that the culprit was indeed the mysterious overalls man, an unknown predator who targeted Julie for reasons only he knew. The crime's nature suggests a violent, essay-motivated perp. Nothing was stolen, and the attacker risked everything for the opportunity to assault and end the life of an innocent, unsuspecting mother of two. Some profilers have pointed out that attacking someone in their home in midday is an extremely high-risk crime, which indicates a level of confidence and perhaps premeditation. In Julie's case, the offender seemed to know that Monday afternoon she'd likely be alone. This has led to speculation that the overalls man stalked Julie and studied her routine beforehand. The sightings of him lurking around asking directions and roaming the area for days support the idea that he was conducting surveillance and planning the attack rather than acting on impulse. Why Julie was chosen is harder to answer. Some have suggested that perhaps the man had seen her around town and become fixated, then formulated his sick plan of action over time. Others have suggested that his initial entry into her house may have been a dry run for what he was planning on doing. Another theory considers that the perpetrator might have been someone who at least casually knew Julie or her family. The precision of choosing the 1-hour window when she was alone could imply inside knowledge of her schedule. However, the investigation found no evidence pointing to any acquaintance with a hidden grudge or obsession. All known friends, neighbors, and family were cleared or had alibis. Thus, if the overalls man knew her, it was likely only from afar. The fact that no one recognized the composite sketch or came forward to say, "That sounds like so-and-so," in a town the size of Grantham, hints that the offender might have been an outsider. Notably, a lingering question is the significance of the missing watch. That unusual Luc de Roche watch, brought from France, was the only thing taken from the scene. One viewpoint is that the perp took it as a trophy, a memento of his crime to relive the experience, a behavior not uncommon in serial offenders. Another possibility is that he removed it simply because it might have been touched or stained during the struggle, and he wanted to eliminate evidence linking him to the scene. If it was a trophy, it could someday be a key piece of evidence if found in someone's possession. Finally, the theory of a serial offender cannot be completely dismissed. The close timing of the Sharon Harper and Julie Pacey slayings, both taking place in one town, is an eerie coincidence. Both women were strangled within 3 months of each other, and both cases remain unsolved. Also stay tuned because I'll be covering Sharon's case shortly in a future episode. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here. Just quickly reminding you to hit that like button and share this video with your friends and family. It was a still autumn evening in rural Oxfordshire on November 3rd, 1888. Farmers had settled their flocks for the night, penning the sheep safely behind fences as usual. The countryside was quiet and uneventful. But shortly after 8 o'clock, that peace was shattered in a night of sheep-induced terror, an event that later writers would dub the Great Sheep Panic of '88. Between 8 and 9 that night, an unprecedented panic swept through flocks across roughly 200 square miles of English countryside. Sheep that had been calm just minutes earlier suddenly bolted as if some invisible terror had descended upon them. They smashed through fences and hurtled over pens, entire herds galloping off in every direction across fields and through hedges. The hill country north of the River Thames was especially hard hit, with shepherds later recalling that all their flocks seemed to go wild simultaneously. Villagers called out to one another in the darkness, trying in vain to understand what was happening as the sounds of havoc carried through the night. People stood in their doorways listening to the bewildering din of bleating and trampling, unable to see anything in the black fields. By the time the chaos finally subsided, the orderly calm of rural life had been upended. When daylight broke on November 4th, the full scale of the event became clear. That night, the normally polite sheep had seen their behavior take what I can only dub a U-turn. I'll let that one sink in for a second. Where there should have been neat flocks grazing on dewy grass, farmers instead found empty pastures and broken hurdles. Eventually, the missing sheep were discovered, scattered far from home. Many animals were found huddled under hedges or pressed into corners of fields, panting with fear. It was as if a nightmare had swept over the countryside, leaving the flocks shaken and disoriented, but thankfully largely unharmed physically. As farmers compared notes that morning, it became clear that virtually every large flock in the district had been affected. From one end of Oxfordshire to the other, few if any farms escaped the panic. The idea that tens of thousands of sheep in dozens of villages could all be terror-stricken at the same moment defied belief, and even veteran shepherds couldn't explain it. In the immediate aftermath, people grasped for an explanation. The first suspects in any livestock stampede are typically predators or pranksters. Could a pack of dogs or wild foxes have roamed the countryside that night, harassing sheep from farm to farm? It seemed highly unlikely given the scale of the sheep panic. Further, there were no telltale injuries or bite marks on the sheep that might suggest predators either. Human mischief was also considered and quickly dismissed. It would have taken an army of troublemakers working in perfect unison to frighten and release so many animals at once, something clearly impossible. With wolves, vandals, and human mishaps ruled out, attention turned to natural phenomena. Some pointed out that the night had been unusually dark, with occasional flickers of distant lightning. There was no raging storm overhead, only a bit of lightning on the horizon, something sheep often experience without incident. An exotic electrical disturbance in the atmosphere, for instance ball lightning, was suggested, but there was no clear sign of anything so dramatic in the sky that night. Others wondered if a tremor in the earth might have been the culprit. Animals are known to panic before earthquakes, sensing vibrations that people miss. Perhaps a slight earthquake ripple passed under the fields, startling the sheep in a way that was somehow not felt by any other humans or animals. However, no one in the region felt any quake, and observatories recorded nothing unusual on that date, though these were rudimentary by our standards. Similarly, some proposed that a meteor might have exploded high above, producing a sonic boom or flash that frightened the animals. But once again, nothing extraordinary was seen or heard in the sky that evening. Lacking any obvious external trigger, some experts suggested the cause might lie in the sheep's own herd instincts. One frightened flock can set off dozens more. If even a couple of groups of sheep had entered panic mode for any reason, their frantic bleating and movement might have carried through the still night air and alarmed other flocks. The sheep could have essentially fallen like dominoes across the countryside. In the end, no definitive cause was ever confirmed for the Great Sheep Panic of 1888, and it remains perhaps the greatest sheep-related mystery of all time. That is, aside from the mystery of the sheep with a star-shaped birthmark. In the dense woods near the village of Mals in western Switzerland, local residents whispered for years about a mysterious figure they called Le Loyon, also known as the Ghost of Mals. Beginning in the late 1990s or early 2000s, people sporadically reported encounters with a strange, silent wanderer in the forest. This figure was always described the same way: tall and clad in an ominous outfit. He wears a camouflage military-style suit worn under a cloak, with an antique gas mask completely covering his face. Yet the very sight of this apparition was enough to strike fear into the hearts of locals and hikers, turning the once peaceful Malls forest into the setting of a living urban legend. One of the earliest documented encounters came from a local woman walking in the woods in the early 2000s. She spotted a tall figure standing in a clearing, calmly picking wildflowers. As soon as the stranger realized he'd been seen, he dropped the flowers and fled into the forest. This peculiar incident set the tone for many future sightings. Le Loyon never tried to approach or attack anyone, and in fact often disappeared into the woods if spotted. Despite this, locals became quite afraid of the figure, believing he may be up to no good. All that said, local authorities were in a bind. Since technically, this individual hadn't broken any laws, if this person actually existed at all. After all, walking in the woods in bizarre attire isn't a crime, and there had been no reports of attacks or property damage. For a long time, officials chose to do nothing and hoped the figure would eventually just go away. In September 2013, Le Loyon was finally captured on camera, providing the first solid visual evidence of this mysterious figure. An amateur photographer had ventured into the Malls forest, determined to document the elusive wanderer. According to his account, he encountered Le Loyon along a familiar forest path. Summoning his courage, the photographer cautiously approached to within roughly 50 feet. The witness managed to snap a photograph just as Le Loyon was walking away, capturing the cloaked man from behind. The photograph provided validation to those who had been ridiculed for speaking of a figure stalking the woods. Local police, who until then had treated Le Loyon as a low-priority oddity, felt compelled to act. As patrols and local hikers began actively searching the woods for Le Loyon, the media frenzy grew. The intense spotlight on the forest would soon prompt an unexpected and dramatic turn in the story. Just weeks after the photograph went public, Le Loyon seemingly vanished. No new sightings were reported in the forest after September 2013. Instead, what emerged was a haunting piece of evidence left behind on a lonely wooded trail. Le Loyon's costume, the camo cloak and the gas mask, was found abandoned on the forest floor, accompanied by a handwritten letter. The discovery was made sometime in the fall of 2013 and was soon reported to the local authorities. The letter was titled "The Death Certificate and Last Will and Testament of the Ghost of Malls." This document is believed to be a reference to the retirement of the character and the urban legend surrounding it, rather than something more sinister or unfortunate. In the letter, the author, presumably Le Loyon himself, expressed frustration and concern over the recent publicity. The letter blamed the press for creating a climate of fear and endangering him. Notably, he referred to the Le Loyon character as bringing happiness to him, suggesting this bizarre act of walking in the woods had been therapeutic for him. In any case, after 2013, Le Loyon was never seen again, and the ghost of Malls Forest had disappeared, leaving behind only questions. From the beginning, speculation abounded regarding the individual's true identity and motives. Without ever having unmasked the person, residents and investigators could only theorize about who would undertake such a bizarre daily ritual. Over the years, several popular theories emerged based on the sightings and the scant evidence. Many locals believed that Le Loyon might have been someone suffering from mental health issues, perhaps a disturbed man who found solace in wandering the woods in disguise. The forest walks, in this interpretation, were a coping mechanism rather than an intentional act hoping to scare others. Proponents of this theory pointed to the letter presumably from the individual, which supports the idea of some sort of therapeutic effect from the somewhat unusual ritual. They also note that despite locals being concerned about the character, Le Loyant was explicitly non-threatening, except perhaps in appearance. Others suggested that the individual might have had a severe skin condition or facial disfigurement that led them to cover up completely for fear of judgment. In this scenario, Le Loyant's costume wasn't about scaring people, and instead was more about conquering his own fears and getting out without judgment from others. Another prominent theory was that Le Loyant had deliberately chosen a hermit-like, off-the-grid lifestyle. Perhaps he was a survivalist, someone obsessed with living in the wild, preparing for societal collapse or an apocalypse. The military gear and gas mask would fit the image of a doomsday prepper testing his equipment, or simply an eccentric person who enjoyed solitude and wanted to be fully left alone. Of course, some people wondered if Le Loyant was in fact an elaborate hoax, prank, or even a form of performance art. Maybe it started as a local prankster's project, or an art student's deranged social experiment that simply carried on far longer than intended. Notably, the local authorities at one point released a statement indicating that they believed the entire thing was a prank being played on the local community. If it was performance art, it was a remarkably dedicated piece, a silent, walking installation that only a few ever witnessed over the course of just over a decade. There are also those who believe that Le Loyant was something more, perhaps someone slipping in and out of time, or some form of extraterrestrial. That said, no evidence exists to support this conclusion. On a quiet autumn night in 2001, a shocking criminal conspiracy played out that would shake the entire nation. Assistant U.S. Attorney Tom Wales was gunned down in the basement of his own home, becoming the first sitting federal prosecutor in U.S. history to be assassinated. Wales had dedicated 18 years of his career to the U.S. Department of Justice, serving as an assistant U.S. attorney in Seattle and specializing in white-collar fraud cases. Colleagues knew him as a meticulous and hard-working prosecutor. Outside of work, he was active in civic life. He served on Seattle's Planning Commission and became a leading advocate for tough gun control laws. This blend of professional prominence and personal integrity made his sudden, violent death all the more shocking. On the evening of October 11, 2001, Wales was working at his computer in the downstairs office of his Queen Anne Hill home when an unknown assailant struck. Sometime around 10:40 p.m., a gunman slipped into his backyard, avoided motion lights, and fired multiple shots through a basement window, hitting Wales in the neck and chest. A neighbor heard the commotion and called 911. When first responders arrived, they found Wales collapsed at his desk. He was rushed to a hospital, but he died the next day from his injuries. Forensic experts determined that the weapon was a Makarov semi-automatic, fitted with an aftermarket barrel. This unusual modification left distinctive markings on the bullets and shell casings, giving agents one of their first solid leads. It was already clear to investigators that this was a planned assassination, not a random crime, and one witness reported seeing a lone male suspect fleeing the scene into the darkness. In the early days of the investigation, agents and Seattle police detectives scoured Wales's professional and personal life for clues. Before long, their attention zeroed in on a possible suspect, a commercial airline pilot whom Wales had prosecuted in a fraud case involving the illegal conversion of a helicopter. In this case, the pilot, along with his business partners, were accused of illegally modifying a military chopper for civilian use and sale. That case, which had been contentious and bitterly fought, ended with charges against the pilot being dropped. The pilot was irate at Wales, even suing the Justice Department for malicious prosecution to recoup his legal fees. Just weeks after Wales's slaying, FBI agents searched the pilot's home in Bellevue for evidence linking him to the crime. However, no forensic evidence tying him to the shooting was found, and he maintained an alibi that he was elsewhere that night. He claimed he'd been at a movie and then on a phone call at home when Wales was shot, an alibi the FBI couldn't disprove. As months passed, agents gradually eliminated other potential suspects, and the theory of a revenge plot by the embittered pilot remained front and center. The FBI also pursued the forensic trail. Knowing the perpetrator had used a rare aftermarket barrel, agents tried to trace every such barrel sold in the United States, roughly 2,600 in total. It was a painstaking nationwide effort, and despite testing many weapons, this effort did not turn up the missing gun. Years went by without an arrest, but the case never went cold. In fact, it stayed an active major case for the FBI, with a dedicated task force continually chasing leads. There were false hopes and red herrings. At one point, a jailhouse snitch claimed a cellmate had confessed to having been hired for the job, but that story fell apart under scrutiny. By 2006, 5 years after the act, no charges had been filed, but investigators were increasingly convinced the answer lay in a small circle of people connected to that pilot. An intriguing twist came in early 2006 when an anonymous letter arrived at the FBI office in Seattle. The letter, postmarked from Las Vegas and signed Gidget, claimed that a woman had paid the writer to eliminate Tom Wales. In lurid detail, the self-proclaimed professional described stalking Wales's house, shooting him through the window, and escaping after collecting payment for the job. The implications were chilling. If the letter was telling the truth, it meant Wales's slaying was a contract job. Agents noticed that the pilot suspect had coincidentally traveled to Las Vegas shortly before the letter was sent, raising suspicion that he might have been involved in this bizarre message. The pilot's attorney vehemently denied that his client had anything to do with the Gidget letter, and the author of the letter was never identified. Whether it was a genuine confession or a hoax, the letter reinforced the possibility that a hired professional was behind the trigger. Finally, in 2018, a significant public update arrived. Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein came to Seattle in February 2018 to announce that the FBI had evidence Wales was slain as part of a conspiracy involving a professional hitman. This was the first official confirmation of the so-called hitman theory by the authorities. Investigators now believed that a small group of individuals had orchestrated the event. Officials cautioned that they still didn't have enough evidence to charge anyone, but they made it clear they no longer saw this as a potential lone wolf attack. The next year brought a hopeful development for the investigators. In 2019, a federal grand jury in Seattle indicted a woman named Shauna Reed for perjury and obstruction in connection with the Wales case. Investigators alleged that she had previously told police someone she knew bragged about being involved in the slaying. However, when she was asked this under oath, she denied ever telling the police this. It was the first time anyone was charged with a crime related to the Wales investigation, an indirect approach aimed at pressuring someone on the periphery of the conspiracy to talk. However, this tactic ultimately fell short, and in a somewhat spectacular way. In 2021, Reed struck a plea deal and pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor obstruction charge, receiving a sentence of 9 days in jail and a $25 fine. She also didn't provide any new information to advance the case whatsoever. In October 2021, the Justice Department doubled the reward for information about the slaying to $2.5 million, hoping to entice anyone with knowledge to come forward. Some believe that this will be sufficient to get someone on the very outskirts of knowledge of the conspiracy to break. As of 2025, however, this has been unsuccessful, and the case of Thomas Wales remains an unsolved mystery. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just quickly reminding you to hit that like button and share this video with your friends and family. Also, when you're done here, don't forget to check out my true crime channel where I focus exclusively on solved cases. On April 13, 1992, workers with the Wyoming Highway Department and a local sheriff made a grim discovery in Sheridan County, Wyoming. In a ditch along the southbound side of Interstate 90, about 5 miles south of the Montana border, lay the badly decomposed body of a young woman. She had no identification and no immediate clues to her name. Investigators determined the victim had likely been slain elsewhere and dumped beside the highway. In the absence of an identity, she became known simply as the Sheridan County Jane Doe. Interestingly, this is a case where we now know absolutely everything except the identity of this Jane Doe. An autopsy revealed that the woman's death had occurred a couple months before her body was found, likely around February 1992. The first examination couldn't determine an exact cause of death, but foul play was strongly suspected. A later forensic review uncovered evidence of brutal violence. The young woman had died from blunt force trauma to the head. Despite advanced decomposition, investigators pieced together a detailed physical description. The victim was a white female in her late teens or early 20s, standing about 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighing around 115 pounds. She had shoulder-length brown hair that was slightly wavy and notably sun-bleached, suggesting she spent a lot of time outdoors. Her eye color couldn't be determined due to the condition of the remains. Forensic dentists noted she had 5 fillings, indicating she had received dental care in life. Crucially, the medical examination also revealed that this young woman had been a mother. Her pelvic bones indicated she had given birth at least once prior to her death. Even more tragically, she was about 10 weeks pregnant at the time when she was slain. From the start, investigators believed that the Jane Doe had been ended somewhere else and dumped alongside Interstate 90. There were no signs of a struggle at the dump site, and the location next to a major highway suggested a quick, clandestine disposal, likely at night. This pointed to a chilling scenario. Perhaps a passing motorist or long-haul truck driver had picked up the young woman and later discarded her body on the lonely stretch of road. In fact, a working theory developed that she may have been a hitchhiker or transient who fell prey to a dangerous stranger. Keep this one in mind as we go forward in this case. One sheriff noted that her sun-lightened hair hinted she might even be from a warmer or southern climate, not a local Wyoming resident. If true, she could have journeyed hundreds of miles from home, which would explain why no local missing people matched with her. Investigators in 1992 had limited tools by our present-day standards, and forensic DNA technology was still in its infancy. Thankfully, they carefully documented the victim's fingerprints, collected DNA samples, and preserved her dental records. These were entered into national databases when those systems later became available in hopes of a match to a missing person or a relative's DNA. Within the first year or two, law enforcement also became aware that the Sheridan County Jane Doe might not be an isolated case. Just 6 weeks before her body was found, another unidentified woman had been discovered on the other end of Wyoming under eerily similar circumstances. On March 1, 1992, a truck driver had spotted a body on Interstate 80 in Sweetwater County, Wyoming, a victim later nicknamed Bitter Creek Betty. An autopsy concluded she died from a vicious blow to the head, much like the Sheridan County Doe. Due to limited communications at the time, authorities saw the two events as separate crimes, given the 400-mile distance between the body dump sites. It would take advances in forensic science to connect these dots. Tests eventually showed that the same unknown male DNA was present in both the Sheridan County Jane Doe and Bitter Creek Betty cases. This meant a serial predator was stalking Wyoming's highways in 1992. One prevailing theory took shape. Both young women likely accepted rides from a truck driver or traveler who turned out to be a sadistic perpetrator. Despite this realization, throughout the 1990s the case grew increasingly cold, with no new leads. The two Jane Does remained unidentified, and their perp's identity was a mystery. The breakthrough would eventually come much later, and from a very unexpected direction. In 2019, investigators in Tennessee decided to reopen a cold case from 1991. This was the unsolved slaying of 32-year-old Pamela McCall, a pregnant woman found strangled off Interstate 65. DNA evidence had been preserved from that crime. When Tennessee forensic scientists generated a DNA profile of the suspect and ran it through the national database, they got a hit, but not to a name. Instead, it matched unknown DNA from two unsolved Wyoming attacks. This was the big break, proof that one man was behind at least 3 horrific attacks across 2 states. With 3 cases now connected by DNA, a task force of state police and the FBI intensified their hunt for the perpetrator. Traditional criminal databases still didn't have his identity, so agents turned to investigative genetic genealogy. They uploaded the unknown DNA profile to genealogical databases, searching for anyone who shared significant DNA segments with the mystery suspect. Before long, this process yielded results. A partial match to a relative of the perp was found in a public genealogy site. By building that person's family tree and zeroing in on the right age and gender, investigators identified a likely suspect, a long-haul truck driver from Iowa named Clark Perry Baldwin. To be sure, before making an arrest, agents covertly obtained Baldwin's DNA from items he had discarded. In April 2020, FBI surveillance in Waterloo, Iowa, picked up trash from Baldwin and tested what they found. The result was definitive. Baldwin's DNA matched the DNA from the Sheridan County Jane Doe, Bitter Creek Betty, and Pamela McCall crime scenes. After nearly 28 years of mystery, investigators finally had their man. On May 6, 2020, authorities descended on Baldwin's residence in Iowa and took the 59-year-old into custody. The former truck driver was charged with multiple counts of first-degree slaying for all the offenses he committed. Baldwin's background seemed to fit the profile investigators had long suspected. He had spent years as an over-the-road truck driver, crisscrossing the country. In fact, Baldwin had a violent history that included allegations strikingly similar to what likely happened to the Sheridan County Jane Doe. Back in 1991, he had been arrested in Texas for the assault of a 21-year-old hitchhiker. During that crime, he struck that woman on the head and threatened to end her life. He was facing significant time for this crime when something unexpected occurred. The woman he assaulted dropped off the face of the earth. Once this happened, the case against Baldwin rapidly fell apart. Upon his arrest, Baldwin was extradited first to Tennessee to face trial for the slaying of Pamela McCall. In early 2022, a jury in Tennessee found him guilty of that 1991 act, finally delivering justice for Pamela after 31 years. With the Tennessee case concluded, Baldwin was expected to be transferred to Wyoming to stand trial for the slayings of Bitter Creek Betty and the Sheridan County Jane Doe. Wyoming prosecutors have indicated that if convicted in their state, Baldwin could face life in prison or even the chair. As of now, Baldwin remains behind bars awaiting the Wyoming proceedings. Investigators from multiple states are continuing to collaborate on any other unsolved cases that might be connected to him. With an alleged perp identified and charged, one major question still looms. Who was the Sheridan County Jane Doe? Solving her slaying was a huge step, but from the beginning, investigators also wanted to give this young woman back her name. Further, as the forensic examination indicated, she was a mother, and her child is now in adulthood, and deserves to know what happened. Bitter Creek Betty also remains unidentified, and I'll be covering her case in a future episode, or perhaps as part of an update episode on the identities of both women. In July 2024, the body of Jacques Freytag, one of South Africa's most accomplished high jump athletes, was found in a field near a cemetery in Pretoria, riddled with bullets. The discovery ended a frantic 2-week search after his June 17th disappearance and marked the start of a shocking investigation into who committed the act. What initially appeared to be a tragic slaying would end up taking on much more sinister elements. Investigators would reveal that Freytag may have actually been eliminated due to his role as a hitman. Jacques Freytag soared to athletic glory in the early 2000s. Standing 6'8", he dominated South African high jumping for years and achieved some measure of international success. In 2003, he won the high jump at the World Championships in Paris, becoming the first South African to claim a world title in that event. He had also clinched World Junior and Youth Championship golds, making him one of the select few athletes to win world titles at youth, junior, and senior levels. He represented South Africa at the 2004 Olympic Games in Athens, further cementing his national prominence. These achievements made him a household name and a source of national pride in South African sports. But injuries and personal struggles later upended his life. After retiring from competition, Freytag reportedly battled severe depression and substance use problems. By 2024, he was facing financial difficulties and had moved back in with family in hopes of a fresh start. This troubled context made what happened next even more tragic and disturbing. On June 17, 2024, Freytag left his mother's home near Pretoria with a man who had offered him a job opportunity. He never returned home. Witnesses later recalled seeing him dropped off in Pretoria West that morning, after which he vanished. His family grew alarmed and filed a missing person report when they couldn't reach him. Then, on July 1st, a police search team found Freytag's body in an open field by Zandfontein Cemetery in Pretoria West. No meaningful attempts had been made to cover up what had happened. Investigators noted signs of overkill. He had been both shot up and stabbed repeatedly. This suggested to investigators that this was no random act of violence, and they immediately began looking into his inner circle. Suspicion soon fell on two people known to Freytag, 52-year-old Rudolf Lubb and 42-year-old Chantal Oosthuizen. It turned out Freytag knew the pair well and had spent time with them in the weeks before his death. By July 10th, police obtained warrants for their arrest, alleging the duo were behind the act. Rudolf, a disgraced former lawyer who had been disbarred in 2006 for fraud, and Chantal, his girlfriend, went on the run, sparking a nationwide manhunt. Less than a week later, officers tracked them to their hideout and arrested them without incident. A tip from a member of the public who had seen their photos in news reports led police to the fugitives' hideout. Both suspects were soon brought to court for the slaying, as well as other related offenses. They were remanded in custody as the investigation continued. The arrests answered the who, but the why remained a mystery. Stunning details about a possible motive soon emerged. Investigators allege that Lubb and Oosthuizen had entangled Freytag in an elaborate plot before eliminating him to cover up the evidence. Court documents indicate the couple conspired with Freytag to end Oosthuizen's fiancé, Louis Harms. In other words, they allegedly recruited Freytag, who was desperate for work, to act as a hitman in a plan to eliminate Harms. Lubb and Oosthuizen are accused of wanting Harms out of the picture so they could be together. In mid-June, just days before Freytag's own death, he reportedly attempted to ambush Harms in a failed attack arranged by the couple. Harms survived the assault and later described his ordeal to investigators, with evidence suggesting that Oosthuizen lured her fiancé to an apartment where Freytag lay in wait. This botched hit is believed to have been the catalyst for Freytag's demise. When the plan against Harms fell through, police believe that the couple turned on Freytag to silence him and cover their tracks, since he was their known associate. At present, the authorities are still trying to untangle the true extent of what happened, and all parties are innocent until proven guilty. On December 1st, 2017, police in rural Hampshire, England, made a grim discovery in a barn near the village of Michael Deaver. While searching the property in connection with a burglary, officers stumbled upon human remains, completely skeletonized, lying in the dirt near an old farm building. The deceased had apparently been camping there. Alongside the bones were a weathered sleeping bag, a backpack, and a road map. No wallet, ID, or phone was found with the body. At first glance, it seemed the unknown man had simply lain down to sleep and never awakened, remaining undiscovered for years in that lonely spot. Detectives immediately faced two questions. Who was this man, and how did he die? A post-mortem exam couldn't determine an exact cause of death, but it found no signs of violence or injury. With no evidence of foul play found on the skeleton, investigators believed he likely, though not certainly, died of natural causes around 2012. This meant his body lay unnoticed for about 5 years. The remains indicated the man was white, of medium height with short brown hair, and likely middle-aged. Police collected DNA from his remains and checked fingerprints, hoping for a match in missing persons databases. But those efforts came up empty. He was not listed as a missing person in the UK, nor did his DNA match any known profile. In 2019, Hampshire police released a facial reconstruction of the man to the media. The lifelike image jogged someone's memory. A local couple recognized it and contacted police with a remarkable story. Back in August 2012, they had met a traveling stranger who matched the barn man's description. He had appeared on foot in their hamlet of Itchenstoke, a few miles from the barn, and asked to camp overnight in their garden, saying he was lost. The couple welcomed him and shared an evening meal. The visitor spoke fluent English but with a strong French accent, and he described himself as a Frenchman touring England on foot. He mentioned he had served in the French military and had partially lost hearing in one ear from an explosion during that time. He said he was headed toward Ireland next to meet his girlfriend, and then eventually they were planning to travel to Canada. He carried only basic camping gear and seemed accustomed to living outdoors. After a polite and grateful stay, he departed on foot the next morning, never to be seen again. This witness testimony strongly suggests the barn man was that same French traveler, likely perishing not long after their 2012 encounter. Hoping to pinpoint the man's origins, detectives turned to forensic science. In 2023, experts at the University of Reading performed isotope analysis on his teeth and bones, examining chemical traces that reflect where a person lived in childhood. The results pointed to a childhood in southern or southeastern France, verifying that the story of the stranger from 2012 was likely correct. His bone chemistry also suggested he ate a diet rich in seafood. Armed with this evidence, New Hampshire authorities launched an international appeal in late 2023, working with the charity Locate International to publicize the case abroad. They spread the man's reconstructed image and story through media in France and neighboring regions. Police emphasized the key details: a French ex-military man in middle age who disappeared after 2012, and urged anyone who recognized this description to come forward. Over the years, various theories have swirled around the Hampshire barn man case. One straightforward idea is that he was a lone drifter, a man disillusioned or untethered in life who chose to roam and live off the grid, dying of natural causes while camping. Another possibility is that he was running from something. Perhaps he left France to escape personal troubles or even a criminal past. Investigators acknowledge this. He could have been on the run, though no evidence of any crime has turned up. If he were wanted, his DNA or fingerprints may have matched a database, which they didn't. More outlandish speculation has even linked the barn man to one very infamous missing person, Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès. While his age and potential appearance lined up, police found no evidence for such a connection and have ruled that out. Others wondered if the man suffered from untreated mental illness that led him to wander. The couple recalled he made some odd claims about his military service, and this behavior might hint he was troubled or not fully grounded in reality. In truth, all these theories remain speculative, and without a confirmed identity, the man's real story, his name and what brought him to that barn, remains a mystery. On the night of July 2nd, 1994, Sharon Harper, a 21-year-old mother and bartender, failed to return home after a late shift. She left the Market Cross pub in Grantham in England around midnight after finishing her shift, intending to walk to her babysitter's home to pick up her 5-month-old daughter, Sarah. The following day, Sharon's body, partially concealed in shrubs, was found at a parking lot on Earlsfield Lane in Grantham. She had been bludgeoned and strangled, and left in the overgrowth as though someone had tried to hide her. The Bedfordshire-Lincolnshire police launched an intensive investigation into Sharon Harper's slaying. Early on, they pieced together a timeline of Sharon's final hours. Witnesses came forward to report seeing a woman matching Sharon's description on the night she vanished, accompanied by an unidentified man. In fact, 2 separate sightings were logged by witnesses. A man and Sharon were seen arguing near the Archways gas station on Harlaxton Road. A similar-looking pair was spotted by a telephone booth along the same road around the time she would have been walking home. The man in both instances was described as being in his mid-30s, with long dark hair. It was late at night and visibility was poor, but these sightings gave police their first and strongest person of interest. This unknown individual, seen in a heated conversation with the victim not long before her death, became the prime suspect in the case. Curiously, despite public appeals, he never came forward to identify himself. Investigators were left to wonder, was he the perp or simply a passerby who argued with her and then parted ways? The fact that he was reportedly on foot raised doubts for some officers, who suspected the real perp must have used a car to abduct and dispose of Sharon. That hunch came from another key clue. A mystery vehicle was sighted in the area. At approximately 3:30 a.m. on July 3rd, not long after the presumed time of the slaying, a dark car was seen parked at the very construction site where Sharon's body would later be found. By the time this clue surfaced, the vehicle, described by some as possibly a dark BMW, had vanished. Police never definitively linked the unknown car to the crime, but it fueled the theory that Sharon might have been driven to the dump site, instead of being accosted by someone on foot. The investigation had to consider every possibility, from a random predator roaming the streets to someone in Sharon's circle who harbored a dark secret. Her fiancé, who had been waiting for her that night and expected to start a life with her, was naturally questioned. It was even explored whether Sharon might have led a double life that put her in danger. Rumors arose that she could have been involved in escort work to earn extra money, given that she only worked part-time and was struggling to support a baby. This was fully investigated by the authorities, and the idea was dismissed for lack of evidence. Over the months and years that followed, authorities interviewed potential suspects and even made 5 arrests in their pursuit of the perpetrator, but no charges were laid. Among those detained was a couple who were taken into custody in 1999, 5 years after the slaying, on suspicion of involvement. This startling development suggested police had received a significant tip or new evidence linking the pair to Sharon's death. However, whatever information led to their arrest ultimately fell short, and they were released without any charges. With the case growing cold, law enforcement and crime analysts began looking at broader patterns. Sharon Harper's slaying didn't happen in isolation. Less than 3 months later, another woman in Grantham, 38-year-old Julie Pacey, was brutally slain in her own home on September 26, 1994. The eerie proximity of 2 strangulation attacks, targeting women in the same town within a few months, set residents on edge. The idea was fully investigated, but ultimately dismissed by investigators. Sharon was attacked outdoors while walking late at night, whereas Julie was slain inside her home in broad daylight. Further, Julie appears to have been stalked for a period of time before she was slain, while Sharon's attack may have been a crime of opportunity. More than 30 years have passed since Sharon Harper set out on that walk home and never returned. Sharon's daughter, Sarah, grew up raised by her grandparents, coming of age with only photographs and stories to know her mother by. Sarah is now an adult, roughly the same age her mother was in 1994, and she's become a vocal advocate for keeping the case in the public eye. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just checking in and seeing how you're doing. I usually put some sort of pitch for something here, but hey, I can mix it up every now and then, right? On the afternoon of February 11th, 2013, television viewers in Great Falls, Montana were startled when their regularly scheduled program was abruptly interrupted. At around 2:30 p.m., the popular daytime talk show, The Steve Wilkos Show, suddenly gave way to the piercing tone and scrolling banner of an emergency alert system broadcast. A blue text bar appeared listing several local counties, and an ominous male voice cut in over the show's audio. The voice announced the following: "Civil authorities in your area have reported that the bodies of the dead are rising from the grave and attacking the living." It cautioned viewers not to approach these bodies because they were considered dangerous. For a few shocking moments, it seemed as though a zombie outbreak was officially being declared on local TV. Within minutes, however, it became clear that no such nightmare was actually unfolding. The alert was a hoax, an intrusion into the emergency alert system that had inserted a fake warning into KRTV's broadcast signal. Station officials moved quickly to reassure viewers that the message was not legitimate. KRTV, a CBS affiliate, announced on its website and on air that there was no emergency, explaining that someone hacked the system to send the bogus report. The Great Falls Police Department also confirmed the false alarm. In fact, officers reported that aside from a few phone calls, nobody in town truly believed a zombie uprising was underway. Not long after the Montana incident, reports began trickling in from other parts of the country. This bizarre warning had not been confined to a single station. Later that same day, at least 3 other TV broadcasters across the United States experienced nearly identical EAS hijackings. In Michigan's Upper Peninsula, viewers of an ABC affiliate were interrupted by the same frightening message about bodies of the dead attacking the living. In La Crosse, Wisconsin, and in New Mexico, PBS stations saw their own signals briefly taken over by the hoax alert. Even a radio station in Southern California reportedly had its emergency system hacked to transmit the zombie warning. In each case, the pattern was the same: an EAS tone, a fraudulent emergency text, and the same recorded voice talking about rising dead bodies. The timing and coordination of these intrusions strongly suggested a single group was behind them, and what first looked like a local prank in Montana was quickly revealed to be a multi-state attack. The emergency alert system is designed to break into programming for life or death information, from tornado warnings to amber alerts and national emergencies. A hacker exploiting that system could sow panic if they broadcast a more plausible false warning. For instance, had the hacker stated that a dirty bomb had gone off in the area, the panic caused would have been much more palpable than the rather silly zombie apocalypse stunt. As the zombie alert story gained national attention, officials from the FCC and the FBI joined the investigation. Ensuring the EAS couldn't be maliciously triggered became a top priority. The fact that the hoax message aired in multiple states made it clear the breach was not a local weakness, but a deliberate attack on the infrastructure of the alert system nationwide. Some speculated that it was intended as a dry run of a more widespread hijacking of the system, perhaps to spread terror or perhaps to crash financial markets. In the days that followed, a fuller picture of the EAS attack began to emerge. Investigators traced the source of the fake emergency signals and found an unexpected lead. The trail pointed overseas. Officials indicated that the cyber intrusions likely originated outside the United States, and they believed the Montana and Michigan incidents were connected. By February 12th, law enforcement had a solid idea of who might be responsible. A station manager at the Michigan affiliate stated that authorities had identified the party responsible for the attacks in Montana and Michigan. In other words, the hacker, or possibly hackers, behind the zombies had been pinpointed. The suspect's name was not immediately released to the public, but investigators were confident they had their culprit. This quick progress in the investigation was likely due to cooperation between federal agencies and the broadcasters, who eagerly shared their log files and technical data. Along with the suspect's trail came an explanation for how the breach had been accomplished. It turned out the television station's own equipment had an Achilles heel that the hackers knew how to exploit. And seriously, once you hear this, you'll understand that these guys were some real elite operators. The emergency alert system equipment used by many stations was accessible via the internet and, embarrassingly, was still secured with factory default passwords in several cases. In an urgent bulletin to all U.S. broadcasters, the FCC warned that EAS devices must be secured immediately. And just to be clear, by secured, they meant change your default password. The stations affected in the zombie incident admitted that they had never changed the default login credentials on their alert systems, essentially leaving a spare key under the doormat. This lapse allowed the attacker to slip into their emergency broadcast consoles remotely. Once in, the hacker was able to initiate a fake local area emergency alert and insert the fabricated audio message into the broadcast chain. Because the false alerts didn't cause injury or real chaos, the incident remained a somewhat peculiar footnote, but for investigators it was a close call. By all accounts, the FBI and other agencies treated the hack as a crime and worked to hold the perpetrator accountable. Yet in the immediate aftermath, no arrest was publicly announced. Despite the early identification of a suspect, officials didn't name the individual or reveal many personal details, perhaps due to an ongoing investigation spanning international lines. It's possible that the case was more complicated if the attacker was truly overseas. For the public following the story, this lack of closure only deepened the mystery. People have asked questions in the years that followed, but no answers have been forthcoming from the authorities. Was it a group of pranksters just having fun at the expense of the public, or something more sinister? Or perhaps had some government agency retained a group of hackers to test the emergency alert system without properly informing all other relevant agencies? Officially, those questions lingered unanswered, as no court case or suspect name ever made headlines in the months that followed. Despite the passage of time, no arrests were made, and no further updates have been provided on this strange event. Imagine looking at your own living room and suddenly seeing the walls stretch and recede, or gazing at your hands only to watch them swell to an enormous size before your eyes. These bizarre perceptual disturbances sound like scenes from a dream. For those afflicted with Alice in Wonderland syndrome, however, such surreal experiences are not fantasy, but an unsettling reality. In fact, the syndrome takes its name from Lewis Carroll's classic novel, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, in which reality bends around Alice. Long before it had a name, the peculiar symptoms of the syndrome were occasionally observed by physicians. In the early 1900s, a few astute doctors noted that some patients with migraines or epilepsy experienced striking distortions of size. For example, in 1904, one American neurologist reported patients who described that everything looks bigger just before a seizure. A few years later, the famed British neurologist Sir William Gowers documented migraine patients seeing objects change in size and shape. These early clues were rare and often tucked away in medical case reports, so the phenomenon remained poorly understood. It wasn't until the mid-20th century that the syndrome truly came to light. In 1952, American neurologist Caro Lippmann published a paper describing patients who felt parts of their body were growing or shrinking during migraine attacks. Lippmann even speculated that the strange bodily changes Alice experiences in Lewis Carroll's story might have been inspired by similar migraine symptoms. For instance, Alice grows or shrinks in size, her neck stretches unnaturally, and she becomes confused about her identity due to these bizarre physical transformations. A few years later, in 1955, British psychiatrist Dr. John Todd encountered a series of patients with episodic visual and bodily distortions. Todd recognized the resemblance of their experiences to Alice's adventures and gave the condition its enduring name, Alice in Wonderland syndrome. The hallmark of the syndrome is a profound distortion in how a person perceives size, shape, time, and even their own body. These episodes can strike suddenly and typically last anywhere from a few minutes to several hours. Importantly, people experiencing it remain fully awake and alert. They know what they are seeing or feeling is bizarre, yet it appears undeniably real while it lasts. There are numerous bizarre and uncanny symptoms which people report. In some cases, objects may appear much smaller or much larger than they really are. A bedroom might seem to stretch for miles, or a car might look toy-sized. In some cases, familiar people's faces can swell or shrink in proportion. Straight lines might look slanted, as if reality itself is warping. A person may suddenly feel that parts of their own body are the wrong size or shape. They might perceive their head as enormous, or their legs as shrunken and tiny. Some individuals experience time flowing strangely during an episode. Movements around them can seem as though they're taking place in slow motion, or alternatively like a rapid blur. Likewise, sounds and voices may be distorted. A person's speech might sound slowed and deep, or unnaturally sped up, as if the listener's auditory perception is out of sync. This can make conversations or ambient noises feel eerily unreal. Some people with the syndrome might see shapes or colors warp in front of them. For instance, an ordinary face might momentarily appear grotesque, or an object might seem to elongate and then contract. These aren't hallucinations coming from nowhere, but rather distortions of things that are genuinely there. Perhaps unsurprisingly, along with visual distortions, many sufferers feel a disturbing sense of detachment. They may feel disconnected from their own body or identity, called depersonalization, or sense that the world around them isn't real, called derealization. This can be frightening, as if they are trapped in a dream and can't quite shake themselves awake. One of the greatest mysteries surrounding Alice in Wonderland syndrome is what causes these extraordinary disturbances. From the beginning, doctors have observed that it's not a disease with a single clear origin, but rather a syndrome that can accompany various medical conditions. Over the years, several primary triggers and associations have been identified, though exactly how each leads to the perceptual distortion remains under investigation. Major proposed causes and associations include migraines, epilepsy, and brain injuries. Notably, similar symptoms can happen due to other better documented mental health concerns or certain substances. However, most experts believe that these latter causes should be classified as part of their separate health concerns, not this specific syndrome. At present, scientists and medical professionals continue to explore the exact causes of this rare medical condition. Imagine trekking deep into a remote Amazon rainforest, where the dense canopy muffles sound, and every rustle could be a creature that intends to make a meal of you. Local guides whisper stories of a hulking, foul-smelling beast that prowls these shadows, a creature they call Mapinguari, described eerily like a monster from another time. The Megatherium, an enormous ground sloth, which scientists say died out over 10,000 years ago, may live on in these legends. Megatherium, whose name means giant beast, was truly a colossal animal. This prehistoric ground sloth measured up to 20 feet from nose to tail and weighed as much as an elephant. It roamed the woodlands and grasslands of South America during the Pleistocene epoch, using its huge claws to strip leaves from trees and perhaps even scavenging meat on occasion. For thousands of years, Megatherium thrived as one of the largest land mammals on Earth. Yet by the end of the last ice age, roughly 10,000 years ago, the giant ground sloth had vanished from the mainland fossil record. Scientists suspect a combination of climate change and hunting by early humans drove it to extinction. Not all of its relatives disappeared so quickly, however. Smaller ground sloths persisted on Caribbean islands, surviving until approximately 2,500 years ago, when humans are thought to have wiped out these remnants. Again, they're thought to have essentially been turned into sloth roast, so let's all take a moment to be grateful for the remaining sloths we have. Throughout the Amazon basin, indigenous communities share remarkably consistent accounts of a fearsome creature known as the Mapinguari. Virtually every tribe has a word for it, often translated as the roaring animal or the smelly beast, because of its terrifying bellow and awful stench. Descriptions of the Mapinguari vary, with some adding fantastical details. Some say it has a single eye, like a cyclops, or even a gaping mouth on its belly, but all agree on the basics. The beast is said to stand about 7 feet tall when it rears up, with long curved claws, matted fur that ranges from red to black, and a nauseating odor that precedes it. Its hide is so thick that bullets and arrows reportedly can't harm it, except for vulnerable spots around the head or belly. Seasoned hunters warn that if you ever encounter this monster, the only wise move is to climb a tree and hide. For all of its ferocity, the creature is said to either be unable to climb or to be afraid of climbing. Folklore paints the mapinguari as more than a mere animal. It's often depicted as a guardian of the forest, punishing those who overharvest or otherwise destroy the environment. In some tellings, it was originally a human, a shaman, who angered the spirits and was cursed to live forever as a monstrous beast. These supernatural aspects mark the mapinguari as a mythic figure, yet many elements of the legend echo the sloth. The creature's long claws, gait, and towering stance are uncannily similar to a giant ground sloth. Even the mapinguari's famed invulnerability might be explained by paleontology. Some species of ground sloths had bony plates under their skin, which could match the lore of a bulletproof hide. Such parallels raise an intriguing question. Could the tales of the mapinguari be exaggerated memories of real encounters with the last megatherium? In the late 20th century, a Brazilian scientist became intrigued by these reports while conducting fieldwork in the rainforest. By the 1990s, he had collected a couple of hundred first-hand accounts from indigenous hunters and villagers who swore they'd seen the mapinguari. These witnesses consistently described an immense, shaggy, foul-smelling animal, unlike any known species, and a few even told harrowing stories of direct encounters. One Amazon tribesman described how a mapinguari's horrific odor overwhelmed him, causing him to faint as the creature crashed through the forest near his village. When he returned to the spot with others, they found a trail of trampled vegetation. Some cryptozoologists believe that the mapinguari is an actual living megatherium that either still exists or went extinct relatively recently. And by relatively recently, I mean within the last 500 years or so. So recent in geological time. Others speculate that the sightings of the creature are based on real sightings of real creatures in the rainforest, overlaid upon real cultural memories of the megatherium. According to this theory, the indigenous people of the Amazon carry a cultural memory of the megatherium in their oral traditions. Despite the intriguing legends and alleged sightings, the consensus among mainstream scientists is that megatherium almost certainly does not survive today. The evidence put forward for living giant sloths remains extremely thin. Extensive searches have not yielded any bones, teeth, fur, or dung that can be attributed to a modern megatherium. Considering the size of these animals, it's hard to imagine a breeding population leaving no trace whatsoever. If giant sloths had persisted into the last few millennia, archaeologists or paleontologists should have found claws or even hides from them, yet none have turned up. In fact, the most recent ground sloth remains on mainland South America date to about 13,000 years ago. This absence of physical evidence strongly suggests that the megatherium is truly extinct. That said, whether the tales of the mapinguari were inspired by ancient encounters with this creature remains an unsolved mystery of the natural world. On March 19, 2024, maintenance workers in the desert near La Mesa, New Mexico, made a grim discovery at the base of a communications tower. There, scattered on the ground, were the partial skeletal remains of a young man, along with a cell phone containing selfies, presumably of this unknown man. The remains were incomplete. Notably, no skull was present, and had likely been exposed to the elements for some time. With no wallet or identification, the unknown victim was designated the Donna Ana County John Doe, after the location in which he was found. Examination of the skeletal remains by forensic experts yielded a basic profile. The John Doe was determined to be male, likely between 18 and 20 years old. He was estimated at a height of around 5 feet 3 inches to 5 feet 5 inches tall. Analysis of his potential facial features was impossible since his skull was missing, but the selfies suggested the man was Hispanic or Native American. No obvious signs of trauma were noted on the bones that were recovered, and no cause of death could be determined. The condition of the remains was consistent with a death that had occurred months or even years prior. Investigators didn't find any clothing or personal effects apart from the cell phone. Notably, because actual photographs of the man were available from the phone, authorities didn't need to commission a forensic artist for a facial reconstruction. Instead, they had the man's own pictures, a rare situation in an unidentified person case, as a starting point to identify him. The cell phone images show a dark-haired young man appearing to be outdoors in a desert-like area. Unfortunately, the phone itself didn't yield an immediate identity beyond the selfie thought to be from the deceased man. Investigators proceeded to use the clues at hand, the biological profile and the phone pictures, to try to determine who this John Doe was and what happened to him. Early on, missing persons databases in the region were checked for any youth matching the description, but no match was found. As weeks turned into months, the case remained cold. However, with clear pictures of the man's face, it was only a matter of time before someone out there recognized who he was. Meanwhile, in Mexico, on June 19, 2022, a man named Jeremias Lopez Santos was officially declared missing to the local authorities. According to the Missing Persons Report, on May 19, 2022, at approximately 4 p.m., the uncle of Jeremias spoke to him briefly over the phone. During this call, his uncle said that he was in Ciudad Juarez, on the border with Texas. Notably, the Mexican Missing Persons Report doesn't indicate what Jeremias intended to do on the border, or if he intended to cross legally or illegally. By February 5, 2025, an Instagram page announced that the connection between Jeremias and the Donna Ana County John Doe had been made. Notably, he's still listed in the NamUs database as unidentified, so it's not clear if the connection between Jeremias and the John Doe has been officially finalized yet. However, given the visual evidence of the photograph of Jeremias alongside the selfies left on the cell phone, it appears extremely likely that they are the same person. That said, as I mentioned at the start of this segment, the selfies on the phone were assumed to be that of the deceased man. There is always an extremely faint possibility that the phone is actually from another person. At present, to confirm his identity and fully give him his name back, it's likely necessary to test the DNA of the Doe against the family members of Jeremias. So with the identity of the man all but confirmed, that begs the question, what happened to Jeremias? Many believe he succumbed to dehydration after heading toward the communications tower in hopes of finding help or water. Amateur sleuths have suggested that spotting the tower on the horizon might have seemed like a lifeline in the barren landscape. Under this scenario, he likely perished of exposure, simply not having enough water for the desert trek. Notably, comparing his selfies to his missing person photograph suggests he was rapidly going downhill during the last days of his life. Others suggest foul play, questioning if something happened during a human smuggling operation across the US-Mexico border. One variant of this theory suggests that he had promised further payment to a coyote when he entered the States, and when he couldn't produce it, he was dumped in the desert. Another variant suggests that he fell ill during a mass smuggling operation and had become a liability to the whole illegal crossing and was abandoned in the desert to perish. None of these theories have been confirmed as yet, and I hope to have an update on this case in the near future. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't done so already. In the early 1980s, a small Colorado publisher released a book that read like a how-to guide for aspiring professionals. It was called Hitman, a technical manual for independent contractors, a slim volume promising to craft the reader into a true pro. Hitman was published in 1983 by Paladin Press, a niche publisher based in Boulder known for its edgy catalog of survival guides, combat manuals, and other forbidden knowledge. The book is presented entirely straight-faced as an instructional manual for less than legal aspiring contract workers. Across its 130 pages, it lays out step-by-step advice on how to enter the business of slaying for hire and get away with it. The author, writing with an authoritative tone, covers everything from selecting a suitable weapon to stalking a target's daily routine. The manual explains how to deal with potential complications, how to avoid leaving evidence, and even how to mislead investigators. The name on the cover, Rex Farrell, was clearly a pseudonym. Translated loosely from Latin, it means Savage King, an appropriately menacing moniker for a purported professional assassin. But the true identity behind that name remained a mystery for many years. The book offered no author biography or credentials beyond the implication that the writer was an experienced hitman, sharing hard-earned secrets from the field. This mystique led some readers to believe they were learning from a genuine pro or someone with special forces training, while others suspected it was all an elaborate hoax to sell books. In time, details about the real author began to surface, adding a surprising twist to the story. According to later media investigations, the author was a woman with no record of violence or military background. She was described as a divorced mom living in Florida who had simply done her research and exercised a dark imagination. Rather than drawing on personal criminal experience, she had built the book's instructions by piecing together information from crime novels, movies, and interviews. In other words, Hitman was essentially a work of fiction packaged as fact. Or at least that's what the official story has been. But digging a bit below the surface, no one has actually shown the receipts on this issue. Notably, the author's identity was kept anonymous as Paladin Press refused to reveal her name or provide any details beyond her being a true crime mom with an active imagination. However, some speculate that Paladin's claim was actually a cover story, attempting to pass the work off as fiction to avoid liability. The line of reasoning is simple. This would have transformed the book from a literal how-to manual into a dark crime novel. The entire thing, including the marketing, would be a form of literary and artistic expression, rather than a literal guide for quote-unquote independent contractors. It would make the publishing of the book essentially the equivalent to producing and broadcasting an episode of Dexter. Unfortunately, whatever the truth about the author, the book would go on to have dire physical consequences. For years, Hitman existed in a sort of twilight zone, widely considered tasteless and extreme, but seemingly harmless in the sense that no known crimes had been directly linked to it. That changed on March 3, 1993, when a brutal triple slaying in Maryland suddenly cast a harsh spotlight on the book. On that day, a man named James Perry entered a home in Silver Spring, Maryland, and carried out an act that was as methodical as it was horrifying. Perry had been hired by Lawrence Horn, a disturbed father locked in a bitter dispute over money with his ex-wife. Horn stood to gain a large trust fund inheritance if his disabled son and the boy's mother were dead, a motive straight out of a crime novel, except it was all too real. Under Horn's direction, James Perry drove from out of state and invaded the Horn family's home. Inside, Perry ended 3 people with chilling precision, with Mildred, Trevor, and Janice Saunders, Trevor's full-time nurse, all perishing that night. In the aftermath, investigators found the scene curiously professional in its approach, the kind of meticulous, detached work that seemed uncommon for an ordinary criminal. Given the significant wealth associated with the Horn family and the bitter dispute, the authorities suspected the husband may have had a guy on retainer. It wasn't long before detectives uncovered a trail leading back to James Perry. What truly stunned them was the discovery that Perry owned a copy of Hitman and had apparently used it as his blueprint. Phone records and receipts showed Perry had ordered the book, along with a guide to building silencers, from Paladin Press prior to the slayings. As the case developed, evidence mounted that Perry followed the manual's advice in exacting detail. Perry had essentially acted out the pages of Hitman, turning theory into reality. Both James Perry and Lawrence Horn were eventually caught and convicted, and Horn was identified as the mastermind, and Perry as the triggerman who committed them. In 1995, relatives of Mildred Horn, Trevor Horn, and Janice Saunders filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Paladin Press. They argued that Hitman was not protected speech, but rather a form of criminal facilitation. Their claim was essentially that Paladin Press, by publishing the manual and knowingly selling it to customers like Perry, shared responsibility for the slayings. This legal argument was virtually unheard of in American courts. Never before had a book publisher been sued for providing instructions that a reader used it to commit such an offense. Paladin Press's defense leaned heavily on the First Amendment. Their lawyers contended that however distasteful Hitman might be, it was a published work of information and was thus safeguarded by free speech precedent. Initially, this argument found traction, and they were successful at getting the case summarily dismissed without a trial. In 1996, a federal judge acknowledged that the book was disturbing and improper, but nevertheless dismissed the lawsuit on First Amendment grounds. He reasoned that written instructions, in and of themselves, didn't constitute a direct incitement to imminent violence under established legal standards. Paladin's victory at that stage seemed to affirm the traditional stance that even the most objectionable speech is protected unless it very explicitly incites a crime. However, the story didn't end there. The victims' families appealed, and in 1997 the case reached the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. In a landmark decision, the appellate judges reversed the earlier ruling. They concluded that Hitman went beyond abstract advocacy of violence. It was effectively aiding and abetting crime by providing detailed practical instructions specifically intended for criminals. The court noted that Paladin Press had even stipulated that they marketed the book to people contemplating crimes. Further, they marketed complementary materials which an aspiring troublemaker could utilize in concert with the instructions given by the author of Hitman. This was a crucial point. Unlike a political manifesto or a violent movie, Hitman was part of an entire apparatus set up by Paladin Press to facilitate the establishment of these services. To go back to the Dexter analogy, imperfect as it is, imagine you're watching the show and all the advertising is intentionally for items which Dexter uses on the show. And not only that, the ads explicitly state that you should buy the items to do what you see being done on screen. With the appellate decision, the matter was kicked back to the lower courts for a trial, which would ultimately never occur. Facing the prospect of a trial by jury and potentially enormous damages, Paladin Press's insurance company chose to settle the case in 1999. Paladin Press agreed to cease publication of Hitman permanently and to destroy any remaining copies in its inventory. Notably, Since the matter never went to trial and was settled out of court, Paladin Press was never actually compelled to produce who the author was. Whether Rex Farrell was a true crime mom with a vivid imagination or an actual pro with real know-how will likely remain an unsolved mystery. In the late 15th century, a quiet convent in Germany became the unlikely epicenter of a bizarre outbreak. It began with a single nun who, without apparent reason, felt an irresistible urge to bite her fellow sisters. This nun lunged and bit one companion after another, and before long the strange impulse had spread. Soon every nun in that convent was caught up in a frenzy of biting. The contagion didn't stop at the convent's walls. As word of the biting nuns spread through the region, other nuns in other convents began exhibiting the same startling behavior, almost as if the very idea were infectious. According to later accounts, news of the initial incident passed throughout Germany, before working its way into other regions. From there, the biting mania then jumped to neighboring countries, even reaching as far away as Rome. In the superstitious climate of the late Middle Ages, the immediate assumption was often supernatural. Many concluded that the nuns must have been possessed by demons or some sort of spiritual affliction. Priests reasoned that if the cause was not an obvious physical illness, it had to be the work of the devil and his minions. The convents convened special prayers and masses, imploring divine help for the afflicted sisters. When prayer alone failed to calm the biting frenzy, the church escalated to exorcisms. These formal rituals were intended to cast out evil spirits that they believed were prompting the nuns to behave like wild animals. These religious remedies, however, had no effect on the outbreak. According to much later tellings, the attempts to exorcise the so-called demons only made matters worse by intensifying the nuns' own fear. Hearing that the devil might be loose among them sent the most impressionable sisters into panic, so that they too felt the urge to bite. In essence, the very belief that they were bewitched helped the contagion spread even faster. With exorcisms failing and the biting epidemic only growing, the secular authorities decided to intervene with more direct measures. Local officials and physicians were called in to stop the madness before it spread further. They abandoned any supernatural explanation and addressed the situation in the most literal way possible. The nuns were firmly told that there was nothing demonic happening, and that the compulsion to bite was not a curse, but a figment of their own imagination. What could have caused such an outbreak in the first place? With the benefit of hindsight, modern scholars classify the biting nuns episode as a classic case of mass hysteria, or what today might be termed mass psychogenic illness. In essence, this means there was no physical pathogen. It was a psychological phenomenon in which mental stress and suggestion led to real physical actions. Mass hysterias tend to occur in places where tightly bound groups of people live under pressure, and medieval convents fit the bill exactly. At that time, many young women were forced by their families to enter convent life. Once inside, they had to endure an austere existence that demanded constant obedience, poverty, and long hours of labor and study. These nuns lived cloistered from the world, in what were essentially communal, high-stress conditions, not of their own choosing. It's not hard to imagine the psychological strain this could create on these women. Frustrations and fears would build up in such an environment, even if unspoken. We know today that such pent-up stress can sometimes find unusual outlets. In the terminology of modern psychology, the nuns may have been experiencing a conversion disorder. This is when an emotional or psychological conflict is unconsciously converted into unusual physical behavior, in this case, compulsive biting. But here, there's also the element of mass psychogenic illness, indicating that this spread throughout these very tight-knit and isolated communities. Notably, in an interesting twist, there is a further mystery associated with the biting nuns that isn't often discussed. It's very possible the story of the biting nuns was exaggerated or even invented. There's no solid contemporary evidence, no surviving convent records, and most accounts come from much later writers who summarize sources that are now lost to us. That said, the main source which is cited for the biting nuns case is Justus Hecker, a highly respected 19th century German physician. Given his stellar reputation, historians of medicine generally believe that he was legitimately working with sources that are now simply lost in the two intervening centuries. On the afternoon of July 31st, 2001, a group of people walking along the banks of the main river in Frankfurt's Nied district noticed a strange bundle floating along. And just a quick programming note on this case. I found out about it way back when I started this series, and I tried to do a write-up on the case a few times, but found myself sickened by the details. But ultimately, I think it's an important case to cover, and based upon recent developments, there may actually be some measure of justice here soon. Around 3 o'clock, the observers realized the bundle was actually a human body wrapped tightly in bedding. Police were alerted, and soon authorities pulled from the river the body of a young woman. The corpse had been curled into a fetal position, enclosed in a bedspread and a terry cloth sheet, all tied securely with braided cloth belts common in Afghanistan. An umbrella base was tied to the body, likely meant to weigh it down and send it to the bottom of the river. However, the weight hadn't been enough, and the bundle stayed afloat, leading to the grim discovery. At the autopsy, forensic examiners determined the victim wasn't an adult woman as initially thought, but was approximately 16 years old. She was small and malnourished for her age, and doctors noted that her developmental stage was more typical of a 13-year-old, suggesting she had been chronically underfed. The girl had shoulder-length dark brown hair and a fair complexion. Her eye color couldn't be determined post-mortem, but her face was still in relatively recognizable condition. There was no clothing on the body, and no personal identification, absolutely nothing that immediately answered who she was. What the autopsy did reveal was a harrowing catalog of injuries, both recent and old. Disturbingly, her entire body bore evidence of prolonged and severe abuse. She had numerous scars across her legs, torso, and even her forehead. There were also multiple round burn marks on her skin, suggesting repeated disturbing acts committed against this innocent kid. One of the most telling injuries was to her left ear. The cartilage was deformed into a cauliflower ear shape, a condition usually caused by blunt trauma or constant battering, and commonly seen in pro fighters. This sadly means that she was almost certainly subject to constant hitting in this region over a prolonged period of time. Both of the girl's upper arms had been broken at some point in the past and had healed improperly, leaving her arms visibly misshapen from untreated fractures. All these old wounds had never received medical care, and they simply mended on their own, painfully and imperfectly. There were even indications of even more sinister abuse uncovered in the examination, adding another tragic dimension to the abuse she endured. The cause of the girl's death was found to be blunt force trauma to her chest and abdomen, the final brutal beating after years of torment. 2 of her ribs had been violently fractured, puncturing vital organs, and the trauma injured her lungs and spleen, which led to fatal internal bleeding. Forensic timing showed that her death likely occurred 2 or 3 days before her body was found. The perpetrators then kept her corpse for a short time, and ultimately dumped her in the river, hoping she would never be found. Frankfurt police opened an investigation immediately, faced with the daunting task of identifying both the young victim and those responsible. With no name to go on, she became known in the press and case files simply as the girl from the Main, a moniker reflecting the river that carried her. Early on, investigators realized this case was highly unusual and disturbing. A teenage girl had been held and abused for years, yet no missing persons report matched her description. This suggested that whoever was responsible had kept her existence a secret from society. The items used in disposing of her body provided the first clues. The ropes binding the bundle stood out as they are commonly worn in parts of Afghanistan and Pakistan. That detail immediately led police to suspect an international dimension to the case. Perhaps the girl herself was originally from that region, or her captors were. Could she have been brought to Germany from South or Central Asia and kept hidden? It was and remains a critical line of inquiry. Investigators considered that the victim might have lived as a quote-unquote domestic servant in a household of foreign nationals from that region. In particular, one disturbing theory gained traction. The girl could have been part of a diplomat's household. If a family from the Afghanistan-Pakistan border area had come to Germany and secretly brought a child with them to work as a maid, it might explain her origins. In such a scenario, diplomatic immunity could shield the perpetrators from scrutiny, making it extremely difficult for police to investigate them. This chilling hypothesis wasn't something the authorities took lightly, and they didn't rule it out even as they pursued all leads. The inquiry spanned well beyond Frankfurt. German authorities made efforts to reach out internationally in hopes of identifying the girl. Thousands of flyers and posters describing the victim were distributed in multiple languages across Afghanistan and parts of Pakistan. The idea was that someone in her place of origin, perhaps a relative, a neighbor, or a community member, might recognize the description of a missing girl. By the 2010s, forensic science had advanced in ways that offered new hope for cold cases like this. The German Federal Criminal Police undertook more specialized analyses of the girl's remains. Isotope analysis, a technique that examines chemical signatures in teeth and bones, provided an astonishing picture of the girl's probable life history. Scientists determined that her early childhood was likely spent in Afghanistan or Pakistan, as initially theorized. Furthermore, the isotopes suggested she came to Germany at a very young age, probably when she was about 5 years of age. The analysis indicated that for most of her time in Germany, she likely lived in a rural or semi-rural environment. Intriguingly, the chemical markers indicated that in the last roughly 2 years of her life, the girl was living in a more urban area in Germany. Frankfurt, a large city, would fit that finding, suggesting that whoever held her captive may have moved her from a countryside setting to the city not long before her death. Another major effort involved giving the girl from the Main a face that the public could recognize. Using the remains and autopsy data, forensic artists created facial reconstructions to approximate her appearance in life. Because her skull and facial features were largely intact, they could produce a realistic image of a teenage girl with a solemn expression. By 2023, more than 2 decades had passed since the girl's body was found, but the case was far from forgotten. In fact, it became one of the focal cases in a Europe-wide initiative to solve cold cases of unidentified victims. That year, Interpol, in collaboration with national police forces, launched Operation Identify Me, a public appeal campaign to identify unidentified female victims across Western Europe. Initially, in May 2023, the campaign spotlighted 22 unsolved cases in Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany, inviting leads from worldwide. The response was significant. Authorities received around 1,800 tips in the first phase of the campaign and managed to crack a case. In one instance, a tip even led to the identification of a decades-old victim in Belgium, giving hope that other cases could be solved as well. Encouraged by these results, the operation expanded. In October 2024, a second phase of Operation Identify Me was announced, with new cases entering the spotlight. It was at this time that this case was formally added to the campaign's lineup. Notably, it has been speculated that new DNA profiling techniques will be applied to determine where her family is. Given that she likely comes from a rural region in Afghanistan or Pakistan, it will be significantly more difficult to build out a family tree, given database availabilities. However, investigators are hopeful that other close family members have immigrated to Western countries and have had their DNA logged. While the dominant theory is that she was trafficked to Germany by diplomats, other theories have also been put forth. And trust me, these theories are perhaps even more horrifying. One theory suggests she could have been brought to Germany as part of an even darker trafficking operation to obtain young quote-unquote brides. International cheddar piles have been known to engage in this disgusting and heinous practice. However, this theory is speculative and hard to substantiate with the available evidence. If, however, her family can be identified, this theory may eventually be confirmed, as they may have been in on this disgusting scheme. I hope to have an update on this case given the investigative efforts spurred on by Interpol. Anyway, let's discuss something a bit more lighthearted next, shall we? Across the remote mountains and steppes of Central Asia, stories persist of a mysterious ape-like wild man known as the Almas. The name Almas, Mongolian for wild man, appears in the folklore of Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and parts of Russia. Described as a human-like creature covered in hair and living far from civilization, the Almas has long been a subject of local legend. Unlike the gigantic Himalayan Yeti or North America's Sasquatch, the Almas is usually portrayed as man-sized and more human in appearance and behavior. Tales of wild, hairy humanoids roaming Central Asia have been recorded for centuries. One of the earliest written accounts comes from the 15th century. German traveler Hans Schiltberger was taken captive and forced through Mongolia. He wrote in 1427 that he encountered man-like savages living in the mountains. He described them as covered head to toe in hair, running wild in the hills, and eating leaves and grass. Schiltberger even claimed that a local Khan captured a male and female of these wild folk and presented them at court. This is one of the first European reports of the creatures later identified with the Almas, indicating that the legend was already well established in Mongolia by the Middle Ages. During the 19th century, interest in the Almas grew as Western explorers ventured into Central Asia. In the 1870s, the Russian geographer Nikolai Przewalski heard accounts of a man-beast in Mongolia called Kunguresu. Mongolian guides told him about a creature with a flat, human-like face, a body covered in thick black fur, walking on two legs. It was said to have tremendous strength and nails as sharp as claws, such that locals feared to approach it. The explorer himself was skeptical and thought these might be misidentified bears walking on their hind legs, but his guides insisted the Kunguresu was no bear. Notably, Przewalski confirmed that Almas lore was part of the traditional knowledge of locals over 400 years after Schiltberger, providing proof this was no passing belief. He observed that a Tibetan medicinal handbook included Almas parts among other ingredients derived from known animals, implying the creature was accepted as real by traditional healers. The sightings of the creature picked up steam throughout the 20th century. In 1958, Soviet scientists, believing that there may be something worth investigating in these reports, set up what they called the Snowman Commission. They interviewed dozens of witnesses across the Soviet Union and Mongolia, including a Soviet scientist who claimed to have seen a family of the creatures from a distance. By the late 1980s, as the Soviets were on the verge of collapse, the commission had logged more than 500 reports of this hairy creature. Unsurprisingly, given the socioeconomic conditions of the former Soviet countries in the 90s, funding for the hunt for the almas came to a sudden and rapid halt. Though accounts vary, the almas is generally described as a hairy, human-like biped that appears more primitive than a modern human. Eyewitness descriptions collected over the years portray an animal that stands roughly the height of a human, with a body covered in thick dark hair. The hair is said to be long and shaggy, covering most of the body except for parts of the face, hands, and feet. The facial features of the almas are often described as distinctly human-like, but with ape-like traits. For example, witnesses speak of a flat nose, a protruding brow ridge, and a weak or absent chin. Behaviorally, the almas is depicted as shy and reclusive, generally avoiding contact with humans. They are usually seen alone or in small family groups, suggesting a primitive family structure. The almas is not typically portrayed as overtly hostile, and accounts indicate that at worst it will make threatening gestures if approached. Notably, according to Mongolian and Kazakh accounts, they don't have their own human-like language, but rather communicate by grunting. Mainstream science has understandably viewed the almas as part of folklore rather than a biological reality. Anthropologists and biologists note that despite the many tales, physical evidence for the almas is lacking. Expeditions and researchers have not found any skeletal remains, and hair samples have invariably turned out to belong to known animals when tested. Notably, as initially guessed in the 19th century, the hair samples have almost all turned out to be from bears. And this is where the mainstream scientific consensus largely stands today. Sightings of the creature are actually just bears walking on their hind legs, seen from a distance. Personally, the idea of a Soviet scientist seeing a family of curious bears and reporting an almas sighting is somewhat amusing, and I'm really not quite sure why. That said, there's one intriguing alternative explanation that has been proposed. Rather than literal survival of an ancient hominid, some anthropologists propose that early humans' encounters with other species could have left an imprint in folklore. In other words, as Homo sapiens spread through Asia, they might have met Neanderthals and Denisovans. These encounters could have been remembered in stories long after those other hominids vanished. Of course, this hypothesis is very difficult to prove, and it requires that oral traditions transmit memories over tens of thousands of years, which is a highly contentious idea itself. Cryptozoologists take an entirely different approach, believing that the creature isn't just some long-preserved memory, but a living being. According to this theory, the almas has managed to survive in isolated groups in this extremely sparsely populated area of the world. They point out that Central Asia is home to the gobi bear, an animal which is virtually never seen, given that there are an estimated 40 to 50 bears left in the wild. The line of reasoning goes that if Central Asia can harbor a small population of bears that goes virtually unseen, the almas could also still exist in the wild as well.